Just give it another minute here. Okay. Okay, so I want to say welcome to everybody. I'm excited to have you all here. Thanks for sharing your Friday evening with us. And we're here to take an inside look at the forestry sector in BC and Whistler. And this is all part of the BC-wide Day of Action on forestry reform. And I'm just going to say hi. So I'm Claire Ruddy. I'm with the Association of Whistler Area Residents for the Environment, or AWARE. And we're co-hosting this event tonight with the Whistler Naturalists. You'll see Sabrina from the board of the Naturalists pop up shortly. Just to give you a quick overview of the evening, we've got a number of speakers. We've got Bob Brett is going to be starting first and talking about the Whistler perspective. And then we're going over to our Herb Hammond, who's going to be talking about the broader scale BC picture and giving us a talk on titled From Intact Forests to Degraded Fibre Farms, a story of a privatized public forest and how we can change that story. And obviously this is all very timely, given that we are seeing increasing pressure in the public to stop the removal and logging of old growth forests. And so for anybody who is new to Zoom, we're going to, hopefully you're in. So that's step one. If you have any technical issues or there's something that you can't hear sound or some of those things, like let us know in the chat and Sabrina and I will try and give you a hand and do what we can. We're going to be aiming for 2 hours this evening. So, and we are going to be recording as well. So if you do have to pop off, you can always access the recordings afterwards. We'll email them to everybody who registered, and they'll be posted on the AWARE website and probably the Naturalist website as well. And before we jump into the formal proceedings, I want to recognize that most of the people who were registered for this evening looks like we're mostly local. So gathering virtually on the unceded territories of the Squamish and Leeward nations. And we're very grateful to be able to do the work that we do on issues like old growth in their territories. To talk a little bit about why we're having this event. So AWARE has a long history of engaging in forestry, everything from pushing to protect areas of the Sioux Valley when there was logging up there, to down in the Ilaho. And we've been very engaged in the Cheakamus Community Forest, which Bob is going to speak to a little bit, which is a three-way partnership with the municipality of Whistler, the Squamish and the Leeward, in terms of who is managing our local forest areas around the Whistler community. And then one of the other things that we were quite excited to do and to see the strong recommendations that came out of the Old Growth Review panel was we were one of the organizations that spoke up for Whistler in those hearings. And so we were really pleased to be able to do that. And now we just need to see the recommendations come to turned into action. So that's a little bit of why we're here, and I'm going to hand it over to Sabrina to give us a little bit of a down low on the naturalists, and then we'll go from there. So over to you, Sabrina.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in tonight. My name's Sabrina, as Claire mentioned. I'm a volunteer with the Whistler Naturalists, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to increase the local knowledge of and appreciation for the natural world here in the Whistler area. I'm also the lead organizer for this year's Whistler Forest March as part of the Forest March BC movement, which is a grassroots movement comprised of citizens, frontline communities, and sustainable forestry advocates mobilizing across BC in a province-wide demonstration to pressure for immediate action on forestry reform and demand that communities have their voices heard throughout all government decision-making related to the future of public land. If you haven't written to your MLA or placed a call to Premier Horgan and our Minister of Forests, Katrine Conroy, yet to voice your concerns, I urge you to do so. Use the resources available on the Forest March BC website and make your voice heard. As you'll hear during tonight's talks by Bob Brett and Herb Hammond, there is a need for change and there is a better way forward. So thanks so much again for tuning in, everyone. I'm going to pass it back over to Claire.
Thank you, Sabrina. So I'm excited to introduce our first speaker. I've had the pleasure of getting lost in the woods with Bob on a number of occasions. And we always find something fun. But Bob Brett, we're really fortunate to have in our community. He's exponentially increased our knowledge of our natural world and was one of the co-founders of the Whistler Naturalists and previously involved with AWARE. And we've had the pleasure to work together on a number of different projects on things like goshawks and northern goshawks. And also one of the biggest projects was in relation to actually documenting the age of Whistler's oldest trees and forest areas. So Bob will talk a little bit about that, but with that work, he analyzed over 1,000 different trees at 100 different locations over the course of about 10 years. And the outcome of that is a map that we created, an old forest map. And that, if you haven't got a copy of that, go and get one, because it's an amazing insight and opportunity to connect with some of Whistler's oldest and in many cases charismatic old trees. And they're all ones that you can easily get to and find with our trail network, etc. So highly recommend going to get that, and Bob's going to give you details on how to do that. Bob is a local forest ecologist and professional biologist, and he has been doing this work for many decades, at least 3 decades, Bob, at least. And so in his talk, he's going to be talking about the forest around Whistler and the Cheakamus Community Forest, and discussing how best to affect change here in the Sea to Sky. So to ground us here in our local area before we go into Herb, I welcome Bob Brett.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire, and thanks, Sabrina, for organizing all this, and thanks, Herb, because I'm looking forward to hearing your talk. I will see if I have any tactical skills and switch over to my presentation, which is I'm going to deal with answering a few questions of how, why, what, and where related to Whistler's old forest. This is an actual photograph. Interesting. So the first thing is, the first question is, how can you tell you're in an old growth forest? And the way that you normally think, I think, of an old growth forest is that it's big old trees. So of course that's true, that they do tend to be bigger trees and older trees. And it depends though on the site, of course. If more productive sites will have bigger trees, so they're big trees for that particular site. They're old trees for that site. But that's the kind of the obvious one. But there are other things about old growth forests. So for instance, if you look at these two photos, you'll see that light does reach the forest floor. And that's because over the evolution of the development of these forests, some of the canopy trees have died and created openings that the sunlight can pass through. And that's the reason why Whistler's old growth forests typically have a very well-developed moss layer. There's an understory of shrubs, often blueberry shrubs, huckleberries and blueberries, and some small saplings, and typically not much of a mid canopy, like in the middle of the forest. Let's check it if I can get this spotlight. Okay, so there's not much in the middle of these forests. They're quite open. So I'd say that the main thing that distinguishes old forests is just is decaying and dead wood. So they're standing live and dead trees that are in various stages of decay. Those trees eventually fall to the forest floor and can remain for many centuries. So a standing dead tree, a snag, can last more than 100 years. Once it falls on the forest floor, it can be more than 300 years before it's fully incorporated into the forest floor. As a result, you get often get the hummocky kind of forest floor like on the left here. And that's just, if you poked into that, that's all orange decaying wood. And then you, on the right-hand slide, you just see just massive piles in some forests of wood. So all this wood is an incredible carbon store. And there is some, it of course depends on the exact forest, but there's far more, maybe say 4 times more carbon stored in temperate rainforests like in our area, or especially Vancouver Island kind of classical forest, than in the tropical rainforest. So I just want to show you some different types of old forests, because we talk about old forests, old growth as being one thing, but there's quite a few different types even within our small area. So this is comfortably numb, and it's productive, kind of typical old Douglas fir dominated forest. The biggest trees are Douglas firs that would have dominated the whole valley bottom before logging in the last 6 to 8 decades. Another type that's even rarer, I'd say, is are these forests like this that are dominated by western hemlock, also Amabilis fir. Similar sites. This one is from lower Blackcomb Mountain. The ascent trail passes through this area, and one of the few areas of the lower mountain that wasn't logged. Maybe the most famous old growth in Whistler is at the ancient cedars. And this is a very different forest. It doesn't have a moss cover in the bottom. It's got big trees, they're not all exceptionally large. See the big spaces between them. And then the understory, because of the availability of moisture and nutrients, is very rich. This is anytime there's devil's club on the forest floor, A, beware of it, and B, you know that it's rich soil. It's a rich growing site. These trees are at least, the oldest trees are well over 700 years old, and maybe even a couple of centuries older than that. So we also get old growth on dry sites. There's quite a few sites like this throughout Whistler Valley. This is emerald forest, but there's also, like, Emerald Estates has a lot of this. The sand wetlands, the upland part of it has a lot of this, where it's just rocky outcrops with 350 to 400-year-old Douglas firs in this case. Emerald Estates. I cored a tree beside a friend's house that was 600 years old and even smaller than these. So they grow slow. It's quite a different kind of forest. And maybe most different are these extremely dry sites where lodgepole pines are the dominant tree. This is again an Emerald Estates, uphill of Johnny Mikes' house, that area. If you know that area, hi Johnny, if you're there. And so these are very wide spaced. There's obviously not a lot of moisture, not a lot of nutrients here. And these lodgepole pines, even though they're tiny, they're between 200 and 300 years old. Probably my favorite kind of forest are the yellow cedar forests, the ancient forests that are in a lot of the valleys that come off the west side of the main Whistler Valley. So Brandywine, Callahan, 21 mile, 19 mile, 16 mile have a lot of these. And these are where you find the oldest trees. So in the Callahan, out of the 17 stands, there wasn't that I cored at, there wasn't one that was younger than 500 years. And I'd say the average was 800 or more. Some trees over 1,000 years old. And the most important thing about these is that they are really different from what is typically thought of as the way a forest works, and where they grow from scratch, and 250 years later they're an old growth forest, and they get cut again or they get burned by a fire or cut for logging, and then it all starts again. These canopy trees are literally growing on top of the canopy trees that preceded them. Fires might not have burned here for thousands of years. Definitely not for 2,000 years in a lot of these sites, but potentially since the last ice age, who knows? But these multi-generational forests are incredibly rare in the world, and we're still cutting them with our community forest. So I'd like to talk about if you're in a forest, how can you tell if it was logged or not? And this is the first clue, is if you see stumps, especially this is an older stump, but if it's got a cleanly cut top, then you know you're in an area that's been logged. This is, I chose this photo mainly because I like the photo. It's actually an example of old logging when it was messier, and this is called high grading, when loggers went through and just picked out the trees that they wanted. This is a Douglas fir, but in a lot of cases there were even smaller cedar poles, and they left a lot of old forest structure behind. And you know, it's kind of funny that that old high grading actually left a better forest than we do right now with the clear cutting we do. But the more typical log forest, I mean, if you're in the one on the left, you know that it's quite different from the one on the right. The one on the left is 60-year-old stand from Cadenwood. The one on the right is from uphill of Loggers Lake and over 300 years old. And there's a bunch of differences you'll notice. One is that the log stand on the left is much denser, very little light, therefore reaches the forest floor. Therefore, no moss or other plants can grow. It's very desolate. There's not a lot happening biologically in these forests. You'll see that even it's very dense throughout. It's often very hard to walk through. And the other thing I'd like you to notice is that there's a bit of in here. There's a bit of old wood. A lot of second growth. You'll see bigger pieces, but that's this sort of wood, or maybe a tree that was fallen during logging and left. And those big pieces of wood in our current rotational modern forestry, where logging will happen again in 80 or 100 years, we'll never see big pieces of wood like that again. Once these old pieces of legacy wood decay, they're gone. So as I kind of mentioned, the main problem with these is that they're, from a scientific point of view, they're biologically not very active. But I just think of them as being boring. Like they're for anyone who, I pity young people who live in a place where everything's been logged, because they'll never know the majesty, the beauty, the spiritual, psychic pleasure and impact of being in an old forest. So kind of got started into that anyway, but why does it matter if we protect old forests? And there's a zillion reasons. I'm gonna because this is kind of an introductory talk, I just kind of introduced you to the forest through the northern goshawk's eyes. So northern goshawk is the modern spotted owl. Spotted owls were the big news 30 and 40 years ago because they were going extinct because of the loss of old growth habitat. In BC, we pretty much managed to extirpate them. Northern goshawks could suffer the same fate because they are also inextricably linked to old forest habitat. Their breeding success, it requires old forest habitat. They will breed in young forest, but the success is much lower. So what does a northern, first I want to say that they are a red-listed species and they are forest predators. So they hunt inside the forest. And that's key to how they choose their habitat. So there are four points about goshawk habitat that the goshawk looks for. So the first is big trees. This is the biggest tree in the stand, and I'll show it to you again in a second. Number two up high there is, if you go way up, you'll notice that there aren't a lot of branches. And so they require large branches high off the forest floor for nesting. They have to be big enough to support a nest, and they've got to be high enough to be secure. Three, they need flyways. So the mid canopy has to be open enough that they can fly through to do their hunting. And then fourth, the forest floor needs to be relatively open to allow access to their prey, like rodents and that sort of thing. So here's a goshawk, not my greatest photo, but there's a goshawk from an undisclosed location in Whistler a few years ago, near a subdivision. And it's sitting in a tree. This is about 15 meters up, another Douglas fir. But what I like to point out is from the stand in the last photo, this isn't comfortably numb. And if Tristan Wilmot and I, the surveyor I went with, kind of looked at found the nicest looking stand, found the biggest tree in that nicest looking stand, and then looked up 15 or 20 meters, and that's where the nest was. This huge nest that was active in 2014 to 2015. And I don't know whether it's been active since. And it's right beside, you can almost see the opening down here is actually where the community forest has been logging as recently as 2016. They actually have flagging in this area. They were planning on logging this as well. And it's something that we really, if we want a target of an area to protect for the future, this whole area around Comfortably Numb is the largest connected piece of old growth that we have left in Whistler at low elevations. This is a busy slide, so if you can just bear with me for a second. Old forests typically, only old forests will have enough big trees for cavity excavators to create habitat for other species. So pileated woodpeckers are the archetypal cavity excavator. They make these big long holes in these trees, and there are all the woodpeckers do excavate cavities, whether it's flickers, the sapsuckers, but also little chickadees and this little nuthatch. They also excavate cavities that are used by other animals later on. So among the cavity nesters are, this is a stolen photo from the internet, and I should have a source on it, I'm sorry, but so raptors like owls and kestrels and other birds, including many ducks, wood ducks, golden-eyed buffleheads use this sort of these sorts of structures. Bats, they also use the sloughing bark of old trees, and many mammals like black bears and the cavities at the base of trees. So they're not, of course, they're not excavated by woodpeckers, but martins, fishers, flying squirrels, bushy-tailed wood rats. Many creatures use these, and they require them. So again, because this is an introductory presentation, I won't go into detail, but please take many scientists' word for it that thousands of species require old forest habitat to survive. There's a bunch of other reasons. Again, I won't go into great detail on this, but fire resistance, more and more research is coming out that old forests are more resilient to forest fire than second growth forests. It's another lesson for the community forests who some people are talking about thinning old growth, which makes zero sense to me. Water quality and flow, you get the best water quality and with modulated flow regimes out of old growth forests. They store water and meet it out over the summer dry periods. If for our area, recreation and ecotourism, it's a clear case that standing trees are worth more to our local economy than trees going down the highway to Squamish. So, and then the final one is that that storing carbon in old forests slows climate change, and maintaining intact forests is also an important way to reduce its effects. Okay, so what's everyone worked up about? Like, why are we here? And it all comes down to, does it make sense to cut old forests anymore? I mean, there's a lot of arguments or discussion around how to manage the rest of the forest, and that's a big discussion as well. But if you look across our valley, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this slide before, but the dirty bathtub ring that is evident, especially early in the year when the forest, the log forest below this line are flushing out in early season and quite light green. Above it is old growth. So the result of that is this is a new map. You can go to Conservation North and go to anywhere in the province and zoom in and see what's happened. There's been some debate about the exact methodology that they've used, but this plays out pretty well for me. It makes sense. So for here, this is I'm just showing. Just checking. Can you see this pointer? Oops. How do I go back now?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting. Never mind. I'll just say that the red. There's a lot of red, and the most important point I'd like to make I think, is that logging removes old forests from the landscape, and I think for all intents and purposes, we can say forever. Because if you take out a forest that's 300, 500, over 1,000 years old, and then plant it like this has been planted, higher elevations up in the Sioux Valley, it will never, in reasonable terms, recover to being the old forest it used to be. It's going to be simpler. It's going to have fewer species that require this old forest habitat. It will have fewer underground fungal connections. There's many reasons why it will never be the same forest again. So this is not sustainable forestry, it's timber mining. Okay, so this is what Claire talked about, our old forest map. I'll see if, okay, so it looks like that. Very small, somewhat waterproof, water resistant anyway. And it's $12.99, shameless plug for Aware, because it helps support old forest conservation. It's it's available at Armchair, at Whistler Museum. You can buy it, hopefully, if we have a farmer's market, at the Aware booths. And you can also go to the library and just see the free version and just see what's there, because as Claire mentioned, it goes through all the, well, about 40 different locations that you can easily find and visit old forests and find out exactly how old they are. So finally, I look forward to a day in which destructive large machines are no longer welcome in our forest or in the, well, just so you know what I've been watching lately as comfort movies on Netflix. So anyway, thank you. And I will, we may have a question and answer period later on. And in the meantime, I guess I will introduce Herb, is that correct? Sabrina?
Yeah, we're good to go.
Okay. Okie dokie. I will unshare. And so, Herb Hammond, very happy to introduce Herb Hammond. He's a registered professional forester and forest ecologist with 40 years of experience in research, industry, teaching, and consulting. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Forest Management from Oregon State University and a Master's of Forestry from the University of Washington. Currently, his work is carried out through Silva Ecosystem Consultants and the Silva Forest Foundation, a charitable society dedicated to research and education in ecosystem-based conservation planning. He is best known for his concept and application of nature-based planning, which he formerly referred to as ecosystem-based conservation planning. Herb defines nature-based planning as the protection and ecologically responsible use of ecosystems through all scales of time and space. He works primarily with Indigenous nations and other rural communities and has developed more than 25 ecosystem-based conservation plans across Canada and other parts of the world. And if I can just add a personal note, when I first started at UBC, in the UBC Forestry School in the early 90s, Herb was the activist I heard about most. He was the only forester I knew of at that time who actually was trying to buck the industrial logging system. He got into trouble with the Association of BC Professional Foresters as a result of it. They actually tried to drum him out of the organization for having the committee to question the enormous clear cuts that led to landslides and other ecological problems. Anyway, I have his book. You can't see it behind me, but I recommend it as well. It's still current. I'd say Seeing the Forest Among the Trees, 1991, is still current. So I'm really happy to introduce Herb and hear what he has to say.
Thanks, Bob. I enjoyed your presentation. I'm envious. You got to talk about forest ecology. I'm going to talk about how humans manipulate that ecology, I think. But obviously, we need to deal with the latter to protect the former. So I'm going to share my screen here and see if that works for everyone. How's that? Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good. Well, this is, I want to start with a photograph of a temperate rainforest on fire in Oregon this past summer and fall. The river you see in the middle of that picture is the McKenzie River. I grew up fly fishing along that river for many years. And this adds an exclamation point behind what Bob said, because what the untold story of these fires isn't that these temperate rainforests were particularly exposed to fire, but the landscape around them had been clear-cut logged over the last 30 to 40 years, and you had a sea of plantations that were highly flammable that really exacerbated the problems there. So I want to talk to you tonight about changing how we manage, or not manage so much as politically decide what happens in forests to avoid pictures like I just showed you. We have moved from from rich intact forests in this province to a landscape that's dominated by degraded fiber farms. And in the last 20 years, we have really solidified the privatization of those alleged public forests. So this is a picture of the timber industry's approach to sustainability. It's the most common system used are clear cutting. When I see a picture like that, I immediately ask myself, what's sustained here? Sustained means enduring. And so forestry, really, the way we practice it is about forest manipulation and destruction. When I was a newly minted graduate from Oregon State with a degree in forest science and forest management, I looked up the word management. And when I saw that it meant manipulation, I was really glad my degree said forest management, not forest manipulation. A tree plantation is not a forest. I touched on briefly that with that fire picture. Bob talked about it as well. Not only a loss of carbon storage and sequestration, but an immense loss of biodiversity. The old growth forest pictures you saw need to be seen really clearly as non-renewable resources. We may be able to grow old trees if we can get out of the climate crisis, but there's absolutely no guarantee that anywhere near the diversity above ground and below ground will return to those systems. One of the sad things about what we're doing is that we subsidize this. In the last 10 years, on average, we've subsidized forestry in BC to the tune of $365 million a year. So this industry that's supposedly sustainable and market-based is a propped up industry. So it gets propped up to begin with the way the legislation works. The objectives for looking after forests are all subject to this constraint without unduly reducing the supply of timber from British Columbia's forests. That applies to the goshawks that Bob spoke about. It applies to the mycorrhizal fungi that you can't see beneath your feet. So that's there to allegedly protect water, biodiversity, wildlife, riparian areas, fishery sensitive watersheds, community watersheds, and the whole landscape. Not just the patch where you happen to be standing, but the landscape adjacent to it, as well as the stand scale. So the legislation, it's dominantly timber, and forest integrity is clearly secondary to it. I've reviewed a lot of legislation from a lot of jurisdictions, and I've seldom seen words like this without unduly reducing the supply of timber. So that is a big problem. And it's a big problem because not just from the standpoint of other species, but of us. The biophilia is a concept that was first developed by E.O. Wilson, a famous conservation biologist. And he reminded us that healthy natural systems are part of us. We're part of them and they're part of us. I have heard many elders in the last almost half century remind me that when we destroy the old trees of the world, we will destroy ourselves. And I think that's what biophilia is speaking to us about. So I want to at least put a few pictures here of forests that make me feel good. And intact primary forests, that term, if it's new to you, just simply means forests that have been unmodified by industrialized human civilizations, or perhaps only slightly modified. So old growth forests are a kind of primary forest. You can have younger primary forests too. But intact primary forests do water conservation, collect carbon and store it, and have the highest level of biological diversity of any other forest phase. So we need them. They were here to take care of us. And instead, we've done in most of them in this province. And we've done them in by clear cuts, which are really need to be seen as lost opportunities. They contribute to global heating and the climate emergency, and they have turned forests, not just in British Columbia, but across this country, from carbon sinks to carbon sources. That's a sad commentary on forestry and a sad commentary on forest management. Not only have they become carbon sources, but they also have been reduced to biologically impoverished systems from very rich biological systems. I want to talk just briefly too about salvage logging. As we have forests that burn, or as the climate change emergency that builds up insect populations that kill trees, we're immediately sparked to go get those dead trees, that quote unquote waste. Well, the first thing I would say is there's no waste in a forest. And I would also say that those natural disturbances will even themselves out. They're part of building new forests. Forests are built on dead trees. You can't have a forest without dead trees. And that's another problem with clear cutting, because you continually cut and plant, and you never replace the dead tree structures that are the foundation for so much of the biological diversity in forests. But there's a very interesting, has been a lot of study of salvage logging, and it can be summed up nicely in this quote from the ecological consequences of salvage logging. Rarely, if ever, contributes in a direct or positive way to ecological recovery. Generally, it can be viewed as a tax on ecological recovery. So don't be fooled that with salvage. Salvage logging can actually do more damage than logging green forests. This is a picture from the ancient cedar forests along the Fraser River in the Robson Valley. And it is a picture of logging waste not uncommon to find in particularly old forests. This is another picture of essential forest parts and processes that are lost. A summary of what's been lost: water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. The highest quality water comes from these systems. Decayed wood holds about 20 times as much water as the same volume of most mineral soils. So it's nature's water storage and filtration system. And we're taking it away when we do this. Biological diversity, habitat for a wide range of organisms, carbon sequestration and storage. This picture, when you net it out from the forest that was there, about 70% or slightly more of the carbon stores are lost from this system. Carbon that would be locked up for hundreds and hundreds of more years is now released. And we lose the spiritual sustenance, the biophilia that we all need, whether we're there in that forest every day or just know in our minds that it exists. So this creates an ecological and social debt to the future. Now let's talk about the public interest. The legislation and policy in BC, the Code of Ethics for the Association of BC Forest Professionals, all claim to protect the public interest. So what's the public interest? Well, to me, you have to start with what I would call essential realities. What are essential realities? High quality water in moderate flows, air purification, carbon sequestration and storage, high levels of biological diversity, needs, not wants, focusing on what we need as a species and as a co-inhabitant with other species of this planet, and well-being, which means meaningful work. So we need all of those realities. All of us do. Those are essential realities are not assumptions of convenience. Sustained yield forestry is an assumption of convenience. The idea that we can renew old growth forests is an assumption of convenience. Forestry is built on this shaky tower of assumptions of convenience, and it is reflected in the laws and policies by which it's carried out. So really, the public interest can be summed up as survival as a part of nature. Now let's look at the public interest in forests per timber companies and forest professionals. It's summed up for them in government legislation and policy, which reflects the needs of the strongest special interest group in that. And that strongest special interest group is led by a very sophisticated corporate lobby, the Council of Forest Industries and the Interior Lumber Manufacturers Association. The BC Chief Foresters Leadership Council is all the corporate chief foresters. Where are the biologists? Where are the ecologists? Where are the communities? There's no standards that to protect forests. Thanks to this Orwellian term of professional reliance. Professional reliance, which is how forest professionals and timber companies manage forests, enables those entities to not provide any valid standards that they're following. They can just tell you it's their professional opinion and you're left to accept that. There's no accountability for it. It's something that there's now a Professional Governance Act, but there's still professional reliance. It's still alive and well. And sadly, that all of what you see there about the public interest according to professionals is supported by the professional association through silence on this matter. And the only thing they tend to say is, well, we're just waiting for the government to tell us what you want us to manage for. Pretty lame, and an association that's pretty dominated by timber lobbies. So I don't think this is professional, nor do I think it protects forests. So what's the real interest? What's behind this? What's behind this is corporate profit taking. And if you look at the 2020 profits for some of the big timber companies, you can see what's going on. This has been, there have been record high lumber prices this year, which have driven some of this profit taking. But there's Interfor, 280.3 million, Canfor, 574 million, Canfor Pulp, interestingly enough, showed a loss for this year of 22.4 million, which isn't a whole heck of a lot of the overall profit of the company. West Fraser made 843 million. Those corporate good years more than take care of poor financial years that we tend to hear about. The problem is the public interest always has a bad year. That's especially when this is what drives allegedly looking after the public interest. The other thing that's happening as we liquidate the easily accessible old timber in British Columbia, companies are moving south. Here's some examples. 2015, there was a concerted effort, Canfor to Mississippi, then West Fraser to Florida and Georgia in 2017, Canfor to Sweden in 2018 and 2019. Both Canfor and West Fraser continue to increase their U.S. holdings. About half of West Fraser's lumber production is now in the U.S. South. What did that leave behind? Well, by 2017, over 20 years, 100 mills were closed and timber industry employment shrunk by about 22,400 positions. That's captured by some good research by Ben Parfit with the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives. If you update that to 2020, there's been more than 26 more mills closed and 6,000 more positions lost. This is really a reflection on the fact that if we had metered out slowly our forests to produce real value-added products on small scales, in ecologically sensitive ways, instead of adopting the plantation model, which gave us the rationalization to clear cut on short rotations, we would be in a different position. But don't think these companies are here to stay. Don't think this is sustainable. My first job in BC in 1972 was with a sustainable timber company called Crown Zellerbach. They haven't been around for a long time. So, and these companies will just become footnotes in history here as well. This is an interesting quote that I came across just recently by a wood business consultant, which kind of backs up what I'm saying about what's going on in BC. Companies that want to have a future really want to be in the US South. I don't think you want to be in BC anymore. The wood supply is too tight. There's so many environmental issues and the government works against you. I don't know where he got the last part from. It doesn't seem that way to me, but the rest of it is kind of an ominous warning to us about what's happening. So we can kind of sum up forestry today in BC by saying that it's focused on logging primary and old growth forests, exactly the wrong thing to be doing in the climate and biodiversity crises. It's the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases. That doesn't even include the machinery used to get logs in and out of the bush or to truck them down the highway. In some cases, it exceeds all other sources combined, but it goes unspoken. Now we're busily trying to make wood pellets from standing forests and what we conclude as or call waste to export to Europe to burn to produce electricity. Well, you know, that per unit electricity produced, that produces more greenhouse gases than burning coal. There recently has been a letter signed by 500 scientists from around the world urging Canada, the US, who are the major exporters of these wood pellets, as well as the UK, Korea, and Japan, who are the major importers of it, to stop this because it's totally antithetical to mitigating climate change. Forestry causes the largest losses of biological diversity across this province, indeed, virtually everywhere that it's practiced. It's the primary cause of water degradation. It's a major contributor to floods and drought. And believe it or not, in BC, it's less than 2.5% of the gross domestic product. That shows you the power of assumptions of convenience about what's driving our economy. Certainly, it's not forestry. So either we're going to change this, or we're going to continue down a path where Earth will change us. I want to compare this just briefly to give you an idea of what we could do to forestry in the US Pacific Northwest. I want to specifically talk about a corner of the Northwest in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana, where there was a Northwest Forest Plan developed about 25 years ago. And that after 20 years, there was a re-examination of what had happened as a result of that plan, and because it was controversial. There was a lot of the same criticism that industry likes to level at conservation interests and ecological interests today. Well, they found that it increased carbon sequestration and storage significantly. It improved water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. It protected and restored biological diversity. And there were healthier, more diverse community and regional economies. I remember I had a slight involvement in this, and I remember when this plan was being put together, there was all kinds of doomsday crying from rural communities that they would dry up and blow away. The exact opposite happened. So we don't have time to get into the why of that, but in part, it can be wrapped up in the word diversity. So why the differences? Well, in that, under that jurisdiction, there has always, public control has always remained in the public hands. And that has played itself out over time to mean that there's clear accountability in legislation for what timber companies and foresters do in forests. That's summarized in the Endangered Species Act, which is a national act in the US. We still don't have an Endangered Species Act in BC, in spite of all the platitudes by the current government. They have a National Environmental Policy Act that requires ecological assessments right down to individual cut blocks. And I'm currently involved with a group in northwestern Montana who is in the process of beginning litigation on a plan with the US Forest Service based on the environmental assessments and what they revealed. We don't have anything that nearly approaches the strength of that act. And there's a National Forest Management Act, which sets down clear standards that have to be met. And again, if those standards aren't met, you can seek redress through the courts. There's a means of accountability. So for a while, there was a lot of litigation, but over time, that's led to cooperative problem solving. And here, the power structure of Council of Forest Industries keeps saying we need to sit down and talk about this, but sitting down and talking about this, the logging continues and there's still no form of accountability. So the landscape level plan there gave priority to protecting ecosystem services and established ecological reserves. I don't think for a minute that forestry is perfect in the US, trust me, but this provides a framework for accountability and a framework for communication. What makes me sad is during the era when these acts were being developed, I remember that the BC timber industries and forest professionals actively lobbied to block these things from happening here. It's not a good statement about our history, and it kind of relegates us to sort of a third world colonial approach to forests. So how do we get here? First of all, we gave public forests to timber companies under industrial control that we call the forest tenure system. That tenure system exists to this day, and it includes community forest agreements like Bob referred to, because sadly, community forest agreements oftentimes follow the same model of conventional forestry that everyone else uses. That in part, that's because they hire forest professionals that bring with them that bias and that education from their background. So we really should call this a timber tenure system, not a forest tenure system. It's not really it doesn't have anything to do with about maintaining or perpetuating ecological integrity of natural forests. But that timber tenure system has proven to be an incredibly powerful tool in the hands of the industry. It shapes how forestry is done. It shapes the legislation, regulations, and policy through a very concerted lobby. And it has huge influence over education and research. It's in the monies needed for higher education and for research, a lot of them flow directly from the timber companies that benefit from the tenure system. So that makes education and research reluctant to bite the hands that feed them. And it affects employment and labor relations big time. I have had the privilege to work with a lot of labor activists who are very progressive in their ideas about what to do in forests. But to a one, they always remind me that they're a real minority in their organizations, because the majority of their organizations are still focused on high wages. And even as the employment numbers decline, the people that are left are still clinging to the timber tenures owned by the companies, because that's where their paychecks come from. So I want to also point out a couple of important features that are not universally known about the tenure system. All of these tenures have what's called an evergreen clause. I find it to be a very clever use of the word evergreen, but it really means that that tenure will be renewed as long as the company wants it. Keep your eye on that word words, as long as the company wants it. The government is legally required to renew that, but the government may only cancel it for cause. So the government can't suddenly decide this isn't in the best social interest and we're going to wind this down. That would violate the contract. And canceling it for cause has not been done. I was involved many decades ago with the Niska in the Nass Valley, where there was actually an attempt to cancel a tree farm license because of an analysis we had done and that had been supported by the ombudsman of the day. If you want to know all the details about it, you can dig up Ombudsman Public Report number 4 on the internet. It's a pretty interesting story, and one, unfortunately, that still applies today. So there's the evergreen clause. Basically, from a timber company standpoint, I get to keep the tenure for as long as I want it, and if I lobby to keep the terms favorable, that's going to be even better. And the government's, i.e., allegedly reflecting the public interest, is out of the picture. But remember, these are public lands, but now companies make money selling or transferring that tenure. Those forests that were gifted to the public, companies now sell the timber cutting rights, which amounts to nothing more than private profit taking from public forests. Here's some examples from 2019. The companies on their books, these come out of their financial statements. West Fraser valued their tenure at 493 million, Canfor 446 million, Interfor 61 million. So they'll tell you in public, and the government will say tenure really has no value because it's public forests. But in reality, this is what's happening. So has this system worked? Well, for a while it appeared to work because it gave cheap access to high value timber that a lot of people profited from at the expense of the bounty of nature. And for a few, corporate owners and shareholders got the big share, forest workers got a small share. They weren't the big time beneficiaries, but they appeared to be. But that's all come at a major cost, ecological degradation, and a cost of loss of employment, around 45,000 jobs since 2000 and growing. Why does it continue? Well, it's pretty simple. The power of corporate lobby. And again, it makes you wonder when you go to the voters booth, what's going to happen? So we get all these promises, but in fact, I think we're governed by corporations, not by governments. And I think the forest tenure system is an excellent example of that. What makes me unhappy too is the ominous silence of forest professionals, professional associations, and educators. If we're going to fix this, people in those systems need to stand up and be accounted for. One of the problems with that is that forestry is a very inbred kind of profession. So people get taught that what they're doing here is the right thing rather than seeing a bigger picture. And they also are taught to not separate their personality from issues. So if you criticize clear cutting, you're criticizing me if I'm a forest professional. And we need to elevate that discussion so we can separate personalities and issues and hopefully engage some of the professionals in moving in a more ecologically and socially responsible direction. So how do we keep propping this up if it's such a low part of the economy? Well, senior government managers have a corporate timber bias. The now, I think, soon to be outgoing Deputy Minister of Forests was president of the Council of Forest Industries. Perverse subsidies. Oh, this is a topic we could spend days on. Professional reliance, which means there's no accountability. It's a huge subsidy. If you aren't held accountable, you can design it the way you want. No standards, another big benefit and lack of accountability. So that also is the big subsidy. We have a lack of field-based inventories on the condition of forests. There hasn't been a modicum of a good field-based inventory for more than 2 decades in this province. How do we hatch timber supply reviews and allowable annual cuts? By computer programs. Enter the assumptions of convenience. We can assume what we want because we haven't confused ourselves. If you don't ask the question, you don't have to worry about the answer. If you don't go out in the forest, you don't know what's there. So ecological degradation is also not included. It's pushed down the road. It's externalized to future generations. There is a lack of public information, which prevents informed debate. There used to be really good Forest Service annual reports. When I wrote my first book that Bob kindly referred to, I got a lot of the statistics out of those reports. But that has not been around for close to 2 decades. And you can't find that information. The Forest Practices Board, which is not a particularly radical organization, has tried to encourage the government to reinstate that report, to no avail. I'll leave it to you to figure out why. So timber companies effectively determine what they pay for the trees too, or stumpage rates. Not a good thing. The US constantly accuses us of a subsidy there, which they're right on. They're not right on all their accusations, but they're right on the subsidy part of it. But that continues. There's no local, regional, or provincial log markets. It's all, and so the timber companies are able, by not having log markets, they keep, and by producing just low valued commodity products, they are able to capture lots of global markets, which is what they're all about, not about BC or Canada. So they ship high valued or high quality commodity products and a lot of logs now across borders. They're remanufactured into high valued end products and sold back to us. We buy back our own timber. That's kind of a duh thing when it comes to economics. So, and if any timber cutting rights are lost, they get compensated for that. In $1988, when Guayhanas was produced in Haida Gwaii, there was about $100 million in 1988 dollars that were paid to companies to compensate them for buying back public land, buying back from a Haida perspective, buying Haida land. And so it makes no sense. So, and when you talk about silviculture, restoration, wildfire resilience, product marketing, a new product we have, that's all done at public expenses too, another subsidy. And finally, there's really easy access to corporate lobbies, to decision makers, which really curbs the access by non-timber interests. So solidifying corporate control is now happening through a more sophisticated kind of lobby called timber supply area coalitions. They're regional bodies that are government sanctioned and industry led. They do not include environmental groups. They do include Indigenous people, but in that unbalanced world, Indigenous nations don't really get a fair spectrum of information. It's kind of the information, the industrial school of forestry that's being led there. But the biggest thing that leaves me scratching my head here is that the government sanctions industry leading these coalitions on public forests. And by the way, I would add, that's John Horgan who set this body up. So that's an alleged social democratic government that's furthering the privatization of forests. Okay, enough. Let's talk about how we might be able to turn this ship around. The Dalai Lama is a hero of mine, and I really like this quote. If humankind continues to approach its problems from the perspective of temporary expediency, future generations will face tremendous difficulties. No doubt about that. So we need to pick a different path. We need to find a different way to be with the forest. The decisions that lead us in that direction have to start with picking a dominant value. Right now, how we approach forests, and for that matter, Earth in general, is through human-centered values or anthropocentric values. There's a different way. We can use kin-centric or Earth-centered values. I want to acknowledge that you see Elizabeth Panashwe there in that lower right-hand picture. Elizabeth is an Innu elder that lives in Shajit in Nitassinan, or what we know as Labrador. And I had the privilege for a number of years to work with Elizabeth teaching young Innu about how forests work and how to relate to them. We spent weeks at a time in tents out in in the forests, or what the Innu refer to as the country, talking about how to be respectful parts and reciprocal parts of those ecosystems. Elizabeth is talking about an old dead paper birch there, and why it's important to maintain in those systems. So I should go back here for just a moment and also acknowledge this term concentric. Dennis Martinez, who is a personal friend, and he and I worked a lot together doing what we call ecocultural restoration in forests. Dennis coined that term, and it really means that we see ourselves as related to everything else in that forest or on Earth. And it's part of, as he explains, the original instructions for indigenous ways of being. And in those, if you see the rest of creation, the rest of Earth, the rest of ecosystems as kin, you don't refer to them as natural resources to be exploited. That would be a little bit like making the same announcement for your parents. So where does this path lead? I could spend a lot of time on this, but this mainly was about the privatization tonight. But I do want to kind of give you a little bit of a hint of what's possible. We need to start with a vision for the forest. If you don't have a vision, you don't know where you're going to go, where you want to go. And if you don't know where you're going, you're likely to end up somewhere you don't want to be. So ecological integrity is the first priority. And where necessary, we need to restore that integrity. That's the first part of it. We need to protect at least 50% for ecosystem benefits. Notice that I don't use ecosystem services. I think services is a word that kind of dumbs down the really high quality benefits that ecosystems provide. I think it dumbs it down to what you pay for internet services or electrical services. And I don't see ecosystems that way. That 50% needs to be well distributed spatially and by different ecosystem types across an entire forest landscape. What I find interesting that's happening in the literature and the science right now is that because of the climate and biodiversity crises we face, there is more and more support that we should be talking about protecting 100% of intact forests. 100%. Sounds like a radical idea. Well, it's only been probably the last 200 years plus that we saw it differently. So we can make that kind of change if we wanted to. And nested between those networks of protection, we can, or what I would call ecosystem and cultural reserves, we can designate human use areas. But those human use areas have to also reflect a concentric value. The end product when it comes to our use is balanced human and non-human use. Whenever things get a little out of balance, then you start seeing pictures you don't like clear cuts. We need to see natural systems as identities to be respected, not objects to be dominated. Here's a couple of examples of some plans that we've fairly recently done. This is a landscape level plan for Shawnigan Lake, and it's for the Shawnigan Lake watershed. You can see, without me explaining all of the individual parts of it, if I can find my point, here we go. All of these, this big yellow is a network of larger protected areas, some of which connect to existing parks and established protected areas. Then you see finer scale networks here of linkages, biological hotspots, old growth forest patches, or later or older forest patches. This watershed has been heavily logged. Some of it is on its third cutting. And so there's very, very little, only remnant old growth left. So a lot of what we were working on here is a focus on ecological restoration, water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. So we can continue that way of thinking, that ecocentric and earth-centered way of thinking down to a patch level. So if you were going to do some, if you found an area where you thought that you could carry out ecologically responsible timber extraction to remove some of the trees, you would do it within a network like this. These pieces here, like this blue is a riparian reserve along a creek. These are linkages that you saw, some of what you saw on the earlier map. But all of the places in this diagram where you see this kind of pink or chartreuse line around them are additional reserves that we added with more close examination of this site on the ground. These are shallow to bedrock soils here that link to this rough area of remaining old, some remaining old trees. This polygon here with that color around it was a forested wetland. There were lots of big trees there, but it was quite wet. This was another small riparian area that we added. Again, some shallow to bedrock soils and so on. The last thing to say about this is each one of those little red dots represents slightly more than 30% of the dominant and co-dominant trees, the big trees on the site. Those stay forever. They're full cycle trees. They grow old, die, fall down, enrich, provide a replacement for the dead tree structures that are so vital in a forest. So there's a real quick run through of some things that are a way of implementing a concentric way of being. So how do we implement this? Well, I think we have to start from our hearts. I have really been educated that way by wise indigenous people. The real solutions won't start from our brains, they'll come from our hearts. And we are the only species that doesn't seem to want to trust our hearts or our intuition, which were put there for our survival. So we need to wake up to that. Some key ingredients are nature-based planning, like I just quickly showed you, meaningful reconciliation with indigenous people, directed by indigenous people, not designed by people in Ottawa and Victoria, but designed by and directed by indigenous people. We need a holistic definition of the public interest, which I hope I've given you a start thinking about tonight. And within the framework of those nature-based plans, within the constraints, then carry out culturally and ecologically and socially responsible control of forests through a system of regional or local community forest boards that implement those plans. That gets local people into the decision-making process. And lastly, the entrepreneurs fall into that practice by bidding on and buying in a competitive way the resources that are offered by the community forest boards. So you see that kind of turns it upside down. Instead of the entrepreneurs or the timber companies owning the public land, they're down where they should be as quote unquote efficiency experts. So here's some real quickly some ideas about what that looks like in practice. I think we need something like a Forest Conservation and Restoration Act. You can call it other things, but that needs to direct and enshrine the principles I put forth here. It most of all needs to redefine forestry. And by redefining forestry, I mean from forest exploitation to forest protection and restoration. We need to establish a government agency to provide the technical and logistical support for the community forest boards. And we need to design a fairly short-term way of moving from the tenure system to community forest boards. I'll explain that a little bit more before I finish. That means doing something like reestablishing the Ministry of Forests under an ecological integrity mandate. The Gorley-Merkel report about a new time for old growth forests makes that exact recommendation. So we need to abolish professional reliance, emphasis on the abolish. Let's stop tinkering with it and realizing that it's a self-serving way for private interest to control public forests. We need to ban selling or transfer of any tenures in the interim. If you don't want it anymore, then it reverts to government and is put into this public system. Legislation requires the nature-based planning we've been talking about from large landscapes down to individual operations. And shared decision-making occurs with Indigenous nations and rural communities. So forestry is not a science. Forestry is a practice. It's an industrial definition the way it's been done today. And we need to redefine it it needs to reflect, first of all, climate change and biodiversity, water, employment, and in decreasing importance, employment and socially responsible economics. If we do those first things of looking after the climate, the water, the biodiversity, the ecosystem, the employment and socially responsible economics will follow naturally. I remind you that E.O. Wilson, who I referred to earlier with biophilia, has written a book about the need to protect at least half of the planet. And as he says, only by setting aside half of the planet in reserve or more can we save the living part of the environment and achieve the stabilization required for our own survival. So a couple of other things. We need a transition strategy, and I would just emphasize here, though, that can be done fast. How fast? I think if we put our minds to it, we can use COVID as an example. I think in a year, at the outside 2 years, we need to pass and implement appropriate legislation, phase out timber company control of forests, including the timber supply, emphasize ecological restoration and bolstering climate resilience, a big one, to create near-term jobs. We can more than make up employment loss through corporate timber management by doing these activities. And we need to phase in community forest board control of forest uses and establish regional log sort yards. Regional log sort yards is how you maximize return from the trees you decide to cut in forests. I'll maybe touch on that just quickly before I end again. Existing timber companies may bid on the timber, but they don't get to control it. How do we finance this? Well, gosh, a wealth tax. There's a great new CCPA policy note on how easy that is to do. I reflect on a few years ago when California was bankrupt, couldn't pay their civil servants. They introduced a 1% wealth tax, and suddenly they were in the black. It didn't make the wealthy poor, but it sure made for equitable distribution and fair treatment of the ecosystems that support us and provide our needs. I think we can also use a tree carbon or biodiversity tax. And what I mean by that is that for the trees that get cut, the bigger the tree and the older the tree, the higher the carbon tax on it. So there's an incentive to cut small trees and protect big trees that way. And it's also a good way to generate money. Forest user fees. I think if we all knew that we had that kind of socially responsible management of forests and ecologically based management, we wouldn't feel badly about paying reasonable fees for areas that are maintained. And climate emergency funds. We seem to be able to print money when it comes to some things. Well, let's start printing some money for forests, because without them, we're not going to be around. So there's a picture of full cycle trees in the Hara-Proctor Community Forest. There's continuous tree cover. What you see in that photograph will stay, period. The trees that were used for logs are gone. How do we implement this vision? Again, a few things here about regional log sort yards. I was part of an experiment done in the mid-90s called the Vernon Log Sort Yard by a progressive forester, Jim Smith and Tom Milne, who worked for the Vernon Forest District. We designed the kind of forestry that you're seeing in these photographs, and then they took the logs to a log sort yard, sorted them into, I think, as many as about almost 60 different log sorts, and then they auctioned them. They embarrassed the province and the timber companies. They made many-fold more stumpage or revenue from that system for the province than the stumpage system that was calculated by timber companies to decide what they were going to pay for logs. Well, needless to say, the end of that story was the timber companies' lobbies slowly shut them down. So they're really important piece of the puzzle, both for local economies and ecological and social responsibility. I mentioned this about the carbon tax. As trees are older or larger, that tax increases. An easy thing to do. It's not, if we instituted that right now, just think what you could, with reasonable taxation rates, what you could raise there. And community forest boards would license non-timber forest users. So they would protect their land base through ecological reserves, so they don't have to worry about that. But in turn, the non-timber forest users would pay reasonable, equitable user fees for that right. So let me kind of see if I can pull these pieces together here. This is a picture of the Hara-Proctor small mill that produces value-added wood products. They also practice ecologically and socially responsible control of public forests. They're overseen by the Hara-Proctor Watershed Protection Society. So there's good balance in the community that way and balance in the way things are seen. With the kind of changes I'm talking about, there's a forest with diverse, fair land bases for all beings, not just human beings, but a concentric reciprocal relationship with forests. Here's an example. Instead of less than 1 job per 1,000 trees cut, which is what happens right now, that's about 30 truckloads of logs, which is a lot for 1 job. Hara-Proctor, for example, gets 5 jobs or more per 1,000 trees cut. That's easily within our grasp. In fact, I would say you can take that 5 and double it. We could easily produce 10 if we did the right level of value-added manufacturing. If we did the 5+ jobs, we could reduce the annual cut by 80% and employ the same number of people. We might not be sitting here talking tonight, as it were, if the annual allowable or the allowable annual cut had been reduced by 80%. It may take a lot of the issues that we care about off the table. So it provides a forest required for ecosystem benefits, for survival, a forest for all beings, human and non-human. The other piece of this is that we need to stop seeing public forests as resources and see them as a public trust held for future generations. There really is only one forest for all values, not a different forest for each value. We need to give priority to the most important values for well-being, with the hierarchy being ecosystem protection, culture and social protection, and economic protection. And that's how we're going to get through this, both climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, and leave a good future for future generations. So back to the stumbling block. We need to change the tenure system. And what's the rationale for that? Well, those tenures, that public land was given to corporations because it was viewed by the government of the day to provide social benefits. Now, and it was given and it was done quickly. We need to now quickly take back that public forest based on ecological and social needs. And so we can use the same rationale and do it in the same way that they were created. And the climate emergency coupled with the biodiversity crisis, and I might add the equity crisis in society, provide us a good foundation to do that. In the old growth or in the climate emergency, those old growth forests and primary forests that Bob and I have been talking about tonight are required for their ecosystem benefits, way, way more than for wood products. And here's a final quote here about this part from Mark Carney, whom we all recognize his name. He is a mover and shaker in the world of finance, now with the UN. But he said very clearly, no industry, oil, gas, or other, will have the luxury of ignoring climate risks. Well, if that's the case, then let's get on with making this change. Let's get on with getting those privatized forests back in public hands. So I'll leave you with the thought that this is pretty much common sense. I feel that we're a little bit like this guy that jumped out of the plane, that we better deploy our parachute or we're not going to like how we land. As people, we need to reassume responsibilities for the forest around us in socially and culturally responsible ways based on ecosystem protection. And I really like the words of Joe Martin, who's a New Chalmers person, manage for abundance. Think like a forest ecosystem, and we can have a happy ending. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Herb. That was super insightful and so much information there. Bob is hoping to do a little bit of a Q&A with you. In just a sec, we have Georgina Dan with us, joining us, who was supposed to start us off. Just a little technical issue. We couldn't have her go first, but I'm so delighted to introduce her now. Georgina is of the Lil'wat Nation. She's also the Cultural Administration Coordinator at the SLCC and is very involved in the Lil'wat culture. She grew up spending time with her parents, gathering various resources from the territory, and she remembers watching her dad prepare to go hunting and cherishes preparing raw deer hide when he brought home his catch. Georgina started dancing traditional Lil'wat style at a very young age and continues to dance both at work and for pleasure. In 2019, Georgina apprenticed with Melvin Williams to learn about weaving with cedar roots and inner cedar bark, practices that blended her love of culture with being outdoors. And we're so grateful to have you here. Hi, Georgina.
Hello. Kakwa bin Schnuknukwa in Chashkluk, Shamasquatich Georgina, Liwa Othkan, Statlia Muthkan, Amishkatintina. So what I just said is hello. My traditional name is Kluch. English translation is sweet. But my English name is Georgina and I'm from the Lil'wat Nation. That's within the Statliamuk territory. I'm speaking the language of the Statliamuk people, and it's very nice to be here today. It's kind of hard to follow up after Herb and Bob, but they had so many good things to say and it was very informative, so thank you both. I'm glad that Herb kind of touched base on kincentric. I feel like that's the way I was raised and brought up, was really culturally and involved with the environment. That's everything. That's my culture. That's my way of being as an Indigenous person. I'm glad that Sabrina had mentioned that I was in the Cedar mentorship, and that was something that really brought light to how much we really utilize the forest. We can utilize the cedar tree. We actually acknowledge the cedar tree as the tree of life, or the lifelong giver, as it does give us a lot of our daily needs throughout our lifetime. We could get clothing, basketry, homes, artwork, jewelry, hunting traps, all from the cedar tree. And we could do it in a way where we actually let this tree continue to thrive while it's standing. As a cedar weaver, as a beginner cedar weaver, I've really learned that we only take as much as we need. We don't take as much any more than that. And if we do have anything left over, it always gets put to use. I kind of wrote a few things down just so I could keep on track tonight. I know our people practiced abundance over sustainability. I did notice that the two before me mentioned maintaining or management. Sustainability is kind of the same thing for me. In my opinion, sustainability means keeping our resources on the lifeline until we've kind of had enough. But practicing abundance, it has provided us Indigenous people with a lot of culture. We wouldn't be able to thrive the way we would have if we didn't look at the trees as a life. So we would honor the life that the tree that had given up for us if we did cut a tree down. I know as a cedar weaver, so again, I was always taught to only take a little section of the tree when we're stripping the bark. It was traditionally measured. I don't want to say traditionally because it's still practiced, but we would only take 2 hand widths of the bark. And before we would do that, we would actually give the tree a nice big hug. And if my fingers were touching, that meant the tree was far too young for me to harvest, and we would move on to the next tree. Today, those trees are called culturally modified trees, and you'll still see them. I know I could definitely identify them when I'm in the old growth forests. You could actually see the tree healing itself from where we have harvested them. And we take the roots while the tree is still standing as well, but the tree is still able to thrive because we only take as much as we need. The forests, so the culturally modified trees, are also a lot of history. There's so much history within them, and for the Lil'wat people and the Squamish, there's not too many fluent speakers anymore. I know for the Lil'wat Nation, there's only about 20% of my people who can speak fluently. And before it was written down in the 1960s, it was all oral. But a lot of our history is written in the land. And yeah, that's kind of what I had to share today. I'm so thankful to be here with so many informational people. I know I have worked with Sabrina before, and I've also participated in the Forest March before, and this is something that I will always be behind, as it's my livelihood. It's everything I am. And thank you all.
Thank you so much, Georgina. Really beautiful. It's always so great to have you, and welcome back. I'm so glad to have your support for our future forest marches as well. And maybe I'll just pass it quickly. We have a few more minutes here to Bob, who had a few questions for Herb, and how maybe we could change things up here with our local forest.
Okay. Thanks, Sabrina, and thanks, Georgina. That was great. So I have a few questions, Herb. I'm sure you can answer them quickly and solve all the problems. And a few minutes. But I guess the first one is, what in a perfect world would you see a community forest doing?
Well, let me step back and say that in the world, the way settler or colonial cultures like we're a part of as structured, we need to have a clear overarching piece of legislation that requires ecosystem-based or nature-based use of, or protection and use of ecosystems. That then boils down to a set of standards that of what that means, so that it ends up being principled in the way it's carried out. Unlike, for example, what happened to much of the Great Bear Rainforest, where the term ecosystem-based management got co-opted. And so not because a lot of people didn't try to prevent that, but it ended up being a political process. So I want to emphasize that we need to have that clear legislation, regulations, and policy that govern how we plan, protect, and use forests. And anyone involved in forests has to fall beneath that. So that, you know, in my mind, legislation doesn't change values, but it's a catalyst for moving in that direction. Because what I would like to see is the kind of values that Georgina just put forth so clearly, and that I summarized briefly with concentric values. I would like to see that emerge as our way of being in a reciprocal relationship with forests. If we get to that state, we won't need a whole bunch of sophisticated laws and standards and things, because it will be how we are. But in the interim, we need that structure. And then community forest boards, to me, the basic principle behind them is local decision-making and local control. So keep in mind, it has to meet the standards. When you say they operate under a nature-based plan, it isn't some half-baked nature-based plan, but it's one like the two examples that I showed you, replete with standards that people have to follow, replete with accountability. So if those standards aren't followed, there's a way of the public holding them accountable. So I think that shared decision-making with local indigenous nations and local people is a good way to bring people together, and a good way to bring that kind of broad philosophy of kincentricity together. And that's, I appreciate the question, because it's not like you just turn out the lights and say, now the people from Victoria who are calling the shots are now going to be in the community. There has to be that structure. That's why I mentioned those three pieces of US legislation, the Endangered Species Act, the Environmental Policy Act, and the Forest Management Planning Act. I wouldn't adopt those Holgus Bolus or anything, but that's a similar kind of structure needs to be put in place here. And then the Community Forest Board operates as a local entity beneath that. They're also supported technically by a central agency. It doesn't make sense for them to have every community forest board to have a broad spectrum of everything from computer and imagery and expertise to ecological expertise. So there would be that backup. But that's kind of how I see that structure functioning. And I would note, like I said in my presentation, that community forest agreement tenures, I was involved in the process whereby they were created. And that process was the result of many of us working for decades to promote local control of forests, because we were tired of what was going on in our backyard, just like you conveyed earlier about Whistler. Regrettably, the fact that got rolled in as a tenure, behind that, behind community forest boards was a bit of a not so nice objective to get access to socially inaccessible timber. And with, in some cases, in a lot of cases, unfortunately, that's been achieved. I've had the good fortune to be associated, and still am associated with, a number of community forests where that hasn't occurred. I just did a 2-hour webinar with the Bamfield Community Forest last evening, that because they're grappling with some of the same things that you're talking about, and they want to make protection-based, concentric-based decisions, not timber-based decisions. So I hope that covers the question.
Well, I guess I have 2 ways to go. I'm hoping I get 2 more questions here. One of them is just in terms of, you went through forestry education. I went through the UBC forestry, and we know that we came from the era when BC had the foresters had their range foresters and recreation foresters and timber foresters. We seem to have lost the first 2, and we've been left with timber foresters. And from my experience, the excellent young foresters I've met still are trained in timber forestry. And I'm just wondering if there's, like, in an ideal world, if there's a different way that we could train professional foresters.
Well, I think that structure, again, I want to emphasize that I don't think legislation changes values, but I think that there's a couple of things to say about values right now. First of all, we live in a society where it feels very strange to me, oftentimes, that we fight for people having any value they want to have, as though it was a personal freedom that we all deserved. My non-Indigenous view of Indigenous cultures is they did the opposite. They recognized through wisdom and knowledge about how nature works around them that there needed to be a dominant value that people were educated in and lived as a way of being. And that was, in one way of saying it, a concentric value. And so I only mention that because, to me, that's what I'd really like to see us move towards. That's where real solutions, I think, get generated. And I think, though, the legislative structure at that interim step I talked about, if that happens, it's going to direct educational institutions to teach forestry, to define it and teach it in a different way. And I think that will be another connection to shifting values into a more holistic way of being with forests. But I totally take your point that right now, the dominant value of timber keeps getting pushed out there. And I know that because I continue to have young foresters, people in school and things get in touch with me because they're frustrated by that. So I also think that's an important thing for activists to put pressure on. We tend to put pressure on government. We need to put pressure on institutions that are turning out people to further those goals of government. We need to, because I have a fairly decent library and I kind of keep track of the literature. My goodness, there's a plethora of literature about protecting forests right now, and a plethora of literature that clear cutting is exactly the wrong thing to do, but we keep doing it. So I think that those institutions need to be held to account, as do professional associations as much as government. I think that would help move those values in the right direction.
And so kind of related to all this, like the driving thing from the province right now is the AAC, the annual allowable cut, which is an interesting term because it's really, in a way, it's a minimum cut over 5 years. And that's one of the constraints that the local community forest refers to quite often. Are there community forests that have been successful in breaking free from that provincial mandate to cut a minimum amount?
Yes, I've been involved with the Hecklip Community Forest, which covers Hecklip survival territory, which is located primarily in the Fountain Valley, that's slightly upstream from Lillooet and across the Fraser River. Uh, they have a community forest that operates under a process of ecocultural restoration, under an ecosystem-based conservation plan that we help them develop, plus their traditional use study. And together, those two documents kind of fuse to develop this process of ecocultural restoration. Dennis Martinez, who is and Hoopa indigenous person that I mentioned earlier, he and I have worked there together off and on through the years as well. And you know what? That community forest is now, my brain's probably a little foggy on the exact date, but it's at least 12 years old. They've never sold a log. They practice ecocultural restoration. Do they have an allowable annual cut? Yes, unfortunately, because that was part of the rules in writing the plan. Do they abide by it? No. Are they challenged by the government? Yeah, a little bit. But they realize that they have a lot of political and legal cachet and power in that negotiation as well, and they've used it not only to the benefit of their culture and their well-being, but to the benefit of the forest. And I think that any community forest can do that. I mean, we Bamfield is struggling with that, for example, and I think that's part of the discussion we had last night. Well, do what's right. It's sometimes easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission. And so you can look at what that community forest has done. They have a website, and you'll see that there's been a lot of very interesting restoration work done, and that's been the focus. The trees that are cut are by and large left in the forest to provide dead tree structures, because much of it had been hydrated in the past, and water is very scarce there. So we want decayed wood because it holds lots more water. It makes the system work better. Anyway, there's one example. The Hare Proctor Community Forest is sort of an example. I think their cut has gone up a little bit. I haven't spent a lot of time there lately, so I'm a little bit loath to talk directly about what is going on. But I think it depends. It's important words to remember. We have as much power as we believe we have. And if we believe we have no power, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if we believe we have power, we can change the world. And I think that applies to the example of community forests and allowable annual cuts. You can build a case right now that allowable annual cuts and rotation ages are passé. They're part of an old way of thinking about forests. And when you apply the new science, they don't apply anymore. They don't apply at all. So I think the door is wide open. I think it's been kicked open by science and the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis. Now community forests, people need to walk through that door.
Yeah, it's kind of a hopeful time, I think. I feel like, well, maybe I'm too idealistic on this one, but I feel like there might be enough people that it might be coming to a tipping point. I hope so. But I have one more question that's kind of modified from Heather Beresford. So the community forest is redoing their ecosystem-based management plan and wondering how to improve it. But I guess if I can maybe change the question a little bit, why did you move from naming what you did ecosystem-based management to nature-based management?
Well, that's like a lot of questions like that. It has a story behind it. When I wrote my first book, as you know, the subtitle from Seeing the Forest Among the Trees is A Case for Holistic Forest Use. Well, I got derided by using the word holistic forest use. some hippie on acids idea of what should be done. And then lo and behold, about 3 years later, I heard timber companies saying, we do holistic forest use. And so then a little while later, a handful of us started referring to it as ecosystem-based forest use or ecosystem-based management. And that term got co-opted. It was denounced and then got co-opted. And then, so then I moved to calling it ecosystem-based conservation plans and or forest use. And I feel like, unfortunately, stringing those words together isn't clear to a lot of people. And I think the idea of nature-based is. And so that's why I've kind of moved in that direction. But you know what? There is an explosion of nature-based solutions, nature-based this, nature-based that. And I've just finished writing a book with two other authors, Sean Markey at UNBC and not UNBC, but Simon Fraser and Cam Brewer, who is an ecological lawyer in Vancouver and once worked with us. And we wrote a book on applying our planning system in urban areas for restoration. We've done a plan for the Still Creek watershed in East Vancouver and Burnaby. And that was kind of the catalyst for this book. And we're still, we call it nature-based planning in the book, but we have a whole little section at the beginning that defines what that means, because I'm afraid nature-based is headed in the same direction as sustainable. I'm afraid that it's just too delicious for corporate developers to pass up. So, you know, in the end, I feel like when it comes to all of us, that our mark is on the land. The real statement of who a forester is what you see in the forest. The real statement of who a doctor is what you see in her patients. You know, that's the kind of thing. And so sometimes I kind of laugh at myself at continuing to play the word game, but it's so I don't know if that's a very satisfactory answer, but I think I think we all need to challenge people who use those words to say, what does that mean? What does that mean, not only in words, but on the land?
Yeah. Well, I am going to pass it off to Sabrina. If I could just thank you again, Herb. That was really good. I'm sure that we could all listen to you for hours, and really interesting and informative. So if I can pass it off to Sabrina.
Yes, thank you so much, Bob. Thank you, Herb. Thank you, Georgina. And thank you, Claire, all for speaking and being here tonight and participating in Whistler's Day of Action for Forestry Reform. Hopefully our audience has gained a lot of valuable insight that they can use to voice their concerns to our NDP government and local leaders here in Whistler. Hopefully I'll see everyone at the Cheakamus Community Forest virtual open house meeting. There's a link posted in the chat so you guys can register. It's on March 29th from 4 to 6 p.m. And they'll be sharing what they have planned for their future harvesting. So hopefully we can all keep tabs on them and make sure everything that is happening here in our own backyard forest is aligned with what Herb's been telling us about tonight. And if anyone has any further questions, feel free to email the Whistler Naturalists or Aware, and I'm sure we'll be happy to try and get answers for you all. So thanks again, and hope everyone has a great night. Someone also asked where to find Herb's books. I will post a link to that as well on the Whistler Naturalists page or Facebook. Have a good night, everyone, and have a great weekend. Thanks for participating.
Thank you.